All right, let's get things rolling. Hey, I'm John McCabe. I offer Solutions Real Estate Services, and I help people get into home ownership today, but not how you think. But before we get started talking about that, if you're looking to get into a home and you've been turned down by the bank for a mortgage, and you have the income to support a mortgage, have somewhat of a down payment, then you might like the book I just wrote, How to Buy a Home for $100 Down, even when the banks say no. Now, if that sounds good to you, just head over to buyfor100down.com. That's buyfor100down.com. And the book explains how I go about getting houses from homeowners and turn them into a rent-own, and how you can actually do it for yourself personally to get a home to move into today and give yourself some time to qualify to buy a mortgage in the future. All right, so now clients typically come to me because just that they're looking to get into a home today, and even though they typically they make good money, they have a very steady job, they've saved up a down payment, they still tell me that the bank is tightening up the lending practices, and for whatever little reason, they're not getting qualified for a traditional mortgage today. And this is happening more and more, and it's going to happen even more in the near future, that people aren't going to be able to qualify because the banks are really going to tighten up their lending practices. So they tell me that once they've been turned down from a mortgage, they're frustrated, they're lost, they don't know what to do, they don't know what direction to go in, they feel like they're alone, nobody's there to help them out or to give them some direction as to what it's going to take to actually get into a mortgage and what they specifically need to do. A lot of times they'll say, oh, you need to build up your credit, but it's a lot more than that. There's a lot more specifics. So they just feel overwhelmed a lot of times. And then they'll start investigating rent-own. That's typically how I end up chatting with them, is because they're looking to get into a rent-own. And a lot of times there's some hesitation on their part because, there's all kinds of horror stories from years past, back in the 80s and 90s, where there was a lot of unethical people out there doing real estate investing. And they're hesitant. They just don't know. It's that unknown, right? They don't know what they're getting into. They don't know how it all works. They don't know how they're going to be protected. What if things don't work out well, or what are the situations that can arise? And I always tell them it boils down to the same thing. As long as you have the rent-own set up and structured properly, as long as it's set up and structured properly and set up for success, then you're going to be protected. Your family's going to be protected. All the other parties are going to be protected into the agreement, as long as you set it up and structure it for success, and using appropriate contracts, approved contracts that adhere to the laws, adhere to the resident tenancy boards, that has the information in it that the bank is requiring, that the mortgage insurers are requiring. It all boils down to making sure that your rent-own is set up and structured properly. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is give you like the 30,000 overview of how to set up and structure a rent-own, whether you're going to do it for yourself or if you're investigating working with a company like myself that does rent-own on a regular basis. So these are the things that you should know before you enter into a rent-own, so especially if you're going to do it yourself. So how would you go about setting up and structuring a rent-own to make it successful and to make sure that you're protected, your interests are protected, your money's protected, and everyone's protected throughout, okay? By the way, if you're just joining us, John with I Offer Solutions Real Estate Services. I help people get into home ownership today. And if you want to get into a home today, but the bank has turned you down, then you might like the book I just wrote, How to Buy a Home for $100 Down, even when the bank says no. You can pick up a copy, head over to buyfor100down.com. That's buyfor100down.com. If anyone out there is actually, if you just type in that you're here, you can hear me. I should have done that earlier. Just type in yes, you can hear me in the comment section. And if someone could just do me a huge favor and type buyfor100down.com in the URL, that would be great. It would really help everybody out, so they could just click on the link. So that'd be greatly appreciated. Again, if you're looking to get into a home but the bank says no, then head over there, grab a copy of my book. It'll really help you out. So, like I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually walk you through sort of the 30,000 foot overview of how rent-own works. So, they say you should never do, too much technical stuff when you're going live, but let's give this a shot anyway and see if I don't, as long as I don't blow things up, I think I'm good. So just give me a second. I think I just got to do this and then this. I think I'm good to go. So how to set up and structure your rent-to-own properly. Again, this is a big picture view of what this all looks like, and I'll walk through a little bit more about it as we're going through. So the first thing you can see, we have your tenant buyers. That would be the individual who's actually looking to get into a rent-own. So they've been turned down by the bank for whatever reason, and they want to get into a home today and have time to be able to fix whatever their situation is so that they can get qualified at the end of the rent-own for a traditional mortgage. And just to let you know, because sometimes that confuses people, rent-own is for a specific period of time. It's to get into the home today, and that gives you that leeway, that time, let's say 3 years. And during that 3 years, you're going to need to qualify for a traditional mortgage. So at the end of the 3 years, you need to get a bank mortgage to buy the home that you've been living in. So that's what the rent-own purpose is. So then you also have the homeowners over here, and then you set up a lease. Now, typically, it can be a standard lease that meets the requirements of your particular province. So whatever your province you're in, each province has a landlord and tenant act or a governing body that looks after the relationship between landlord and tenants. And they typically have a standardized lease. Just make sure that whatever lease you're using, it adheres to the guidelines of your particular province or state if you're in the US, making sure that it adheres to those specific guidelines. And whatever is in the Landlord and Tenant Act of your province or your state or whatever the governing body is, the rules and regulations, that's going to supersede any document that you actually have signed. So you can put all kinds of things in the lease, but if they contravene anything in the act, they're just null and voids, and the act will always prevail. Okay, so you have a typical lease setup. I'm sure a lot of people have been tenants before or landlords, so you're familiar with setting up a lease. Now, you see here that for a rent-own to be structured properly, you can see I have an option company set up here. I gave it a name at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Alberta Limited. And specifically in Alberta, so because this is the case in Alberta, we just made it nationwide that this is good practice to do this. So there's an act, the Property Act of Alberta. There's a section 34, subsection 1. There's an adjournment clause, and I actually wrote that in one of my books, one of my first books, this one here. I'm just going to read that little passage and just explain, because we actually, one of my associates actually got caught up in this. He was early on in the early 2000s. He was just doing the lease, and he was doing the options directly with the owner. And what ended up happening, the owner discovered that there was a passage in the act, and he did not want to sell the property to my associate who was structuring the rent-own for another party. So this mistake ended up costing my associate $70,000 because he had people in the property that agreed to buy the property. The owner wasn't going to sell it to him, so he had to pay the owner an extra $70,000. This is a very hard lesson to learn. So basically what it says is the person that is leasing the property from the owner cannot hold an option to purchase at the same time. So the same party cannot hold the two agreements. So what we need to do is we actually have to have the option to purchase, not go directly from the owners to the tenant, but we have to send it up through a third party or typically we set up a numbered company. It's really a shell company. There's no activity. There's nothing there. It's just holding the agreements, the option to purchase as well as the sales contract between the owners and the company, and then the company and the tenant. So that is to ensure that at the end of the rent to own, that the tenant or the owner cannot back out on any arrangement that they have with the tenant. Sorry, I just realized I forgot to turn that off. So this is to ensure that it's done properly. So what we've done is we've just standardized this right across the country with with my company, with the structuring rent owns. So you want to make sure that the option contract and the purchase contract is set up with a corporation. Like I said, it's just a shell corporation. Typically, you can start one up $500-600 in Alberta, and that you're just filing 0 tax returns because there's no activity, there's nothing going on. It's just holding the contracts. Okay, so that is how the typical rent-to-own structure needs to be done properly to ensure that all parties are protected legally. Okay, but there's another thing that we must take a look at, and that is going back to my slideshow, a caveat. So the individual, so if the tenant buyer, if you're the tenant buyer, you're the person that you go out and you talk to a homeowner and say, hey, I'd like to rent your property for 2-3 years and then buy it. And you present them, you present the information to the owner, and you negotiate on price and terms. You say, great, yeah, okay, let's do it. So if you're the buyer, then you're going to go out and you're going to create this corporation to make sure it's done properly so that you're protecting yourself as well as the owner. If the owner is structuring the rent to own, they're going to want to do this to protect themselves. So there's protection based on the law, and there's also protection based on liability. So this is just standard practice. And if you ever are going into enter into a rent to own and this is not structured this way, run as fast as you can away from that rent to own, because you're just setting yourself up for failure and heartache and headaches. Okay, make sure it's set up like this. So then whoever is looking after the corporation, if the tenant is setting this up and they are running the corporation, then they would want to register the option to purchase and the purchase agreement on title with land titles for the option corporation as well as the tenant themselves. So there'd be 2 caveats registered, one in the name of the corporation, one in the name of the tenant. So both parties have their interests protected. And so that way, if the owner ever stops paying the mortgage or any liens come on the property, that your rights are actually protected ahead of anything else that's going to happen. So if the owner ever stops paying the mortgage or gets behind and the bank is going to foreclose, they have to, the bank, the legal process of foreclosure is they have to send notifications to everybody who has registered anything on title. So you want to make sure that, hey, you're paying Mr. Owner, and Mr. Owner is not paying the bank. So you can step in and you can actually take over the property. With the agreements that we use, we actually have it built in. So if that ever happened, where I'm looking after a rent to own with my contracts and the owner does not pay, we actually step in legally because of our contracts and take over the property, and we get it at a much deeper discount at the end of the term. So this is how you would structure it if you're doing it yourself. If you're the tenant buyer and you're gonna go out and you're gonna attract a homeowner, you're gonna negotiate, and then you're gonna set up and structure it. This is how you would structure it, and the contracts you would need. You would need a lease, you need an option to purchase, and you need a purchase contract, and then register caveats. Now, the way that our company, like a company like mine would do it, is just a little bit different. We would have another company here, the property management company, and the lease would go with the property management company from the tenant, and then I would have a separate lease with the owner. So there's different contracts. The lease and the lease for the tenant and the lease for the owner are different agreements. We don't use the same ones, and there's different wording and different things involved. And the option with the tenant and the option with the owner are different as well. So for a company like mine, when we set it up, it's structured something like this. although ours is actually a little bit more complicated. I actually have a diagram. This is actually how ours is structured. So we're not going to get into too much of that today. It's a little bit more complicated than anyone needs to know. But for yourself, this is a typical setup and structure that you're going to want to make sure is in place when you're doing your rent to own. So when I get calls from people that they want to hire my company to set up and structure the rent to own for them, they don't want, they just want to make sure it's done right. They're going to manage it. They're going to look after everything. They just call my company in to do it. And this is how I would set it up and structure it between the two parties. Just make sure that there's a company involved and do the lease between the two and the options going to the company. So legally, this is how you want to set up and structure your rent to own properly. I advise you to do it this manner right across the country, regardless of where you're at. And the corporation making sure that they register the caveats on title. One caveat for the option to purchase and the purchase contract between the owner and the company, and also they would be the ones to register it for the tenant as well. So the tenant doesn't register it; it's the company that actually registers it. Okay. Now, with respect to, so this is how do you make sure it's set up properly with respect to the agreements. That is something a little bit different. You want to make sure you can see there that there's actually 3 separate agreements that we use. There's the specific lease, the purchase agreement, which is typically the purchase contract that the realtors use in whatever province you're in, and then the options to purchase contract. And the option to purchase contract is really the most powerful contract of all 3, because the other 2, the purchase agreement contract is a standard agreement for whatever your province. The lease is a standardized lease for whatever your province. The real power is held in the option agreement. So when you're getting involved in something like this, or you're going to do this yourself, just make sure that you're working with either a lawyer or a company that is able to set up and structure this for you on your behalf. Okay, so the main thing to remember if you're looking to setting up and structuring your rent to own properly, I just laid out the structure. The number one tip that I can give you that's always going to save yourself and looks after, make sure all parties are represented and the risks are minimal to all parties, is having the appropriate contracts, having the right contracts for structuring a rent to own. That is the key to everyone's success in doing the rent to own, whether it be the tenant who's getting into the home, the homeowner who's putting their home up for a rent to own, and for someone like myself who runs a business of doing this. All parties are protected with the right contracts. So that's the biggest tip I can give everybody. When you're setting up and structuring your rent to own, make sure it's done properly as I just laid out, but really the contracts are the key. Okay, so if you're really serious about getting into a home and the bank has turned you down, but you've got a stable job, you've got money coming in, you've even built up a down payment, but the banks are just tightening up their lending practices and they just turned you down and you're not qualifying, head over and pick up a copy of my book, How to Buy a Home for $100 Down, even when the bank says no. And you can get that by going to buyfor100down.com. That's buyfor100down.com. And you can pick up a copy. And just to give you a little insight as to where the 100 down comes, doing this as a business, when I first started, I was not able to buy any houses as a real estate investor. And in order to do this full time, I needed to do a number of properties and have them going on a regular basis. So I just couldn't afford to give the owners a lot of money. But in order to make a contract valid, I needed to give them something. So it was like $100. So I decided that every owner I was going to go to is like, I'm going to rent your company, or my company is going to rent your home. We're going to buy it we're going to have the option to buy it in the future. And I do this on a regular basis. So, and we don't give a down payment. I only give $100 to make the contracts valid. And I never had any kickback from any owner wanting large down payment on the contracts. So I was able to pick up over 50 houses for $100 down and have typically anywhere from 2 to 3 years, generally, mostly 3 years, sometimes 5, sometimes 2, to be able to qualify for a mortgage, giving the tenant buyer lots of time to get into a home. So that's where the $100 comes down. So the book is about how you can actually go out and do just what I did: attract the homeowner, negotiate, present and negotiate, and structure and set up your rent own. So like I said, if you want to pick up a copy, go ahead, head over to buyfor100down.com. And if you have any questions, just type them in the comments field. And what I'm going to be doing is anyone that types in the questions, I have to run right away, but I'll either type them back in or respond, or I'll do a video specifically on whatever the topic of the questions are. But go ahead, type those questions in, and look forward to chatting with you guys again in the near future. And make sure everyone stays safe. Practice your social distancing, practice your hand washing, and all the other things that the health representatives are telling you to do to stay safe. All right, have yourself a great day, and look forward to chatting with you again soon.